What is your worst experience with bad neighbors? We had some neighbors that used to leave their garbage out in plastic bags the night before garbage day, instead of putting it in a bin. Around here, that's just ringing the dinner bell for raccoons and other critters. Sure enough, come morning there's garbage strewn all over the neighborhood. What the raccoons and skunks didn't spread around, the wind picked up the slack. Some of the people on the street kindly approached the guy and asked him to put his garbage in a bin. He told them to go FCK themselves. Thus began the garbage wars. Every morning of garbage day some people on my street would collect all the half-eaten and rotten trash from their lawns and toss it back into the dude's backyard. He would collect it, then dump it back on their lawns. Or cram it into their bushes. People started finding half-eaten burritos and candy wrappers in their mailboxes. The street started to look like a slum. Police were called, health inspectors, city by law enforcement. Each side was calling in whatever authority they could muster to get their enemy in shit. The dude and his family, amazingly his wife seemed perfectly pleasant, lasted about 8 months then moved. Every once in a while I find a random margarine lid or piece of styrofoam in my hedge, and my mind goes back to those dark days of war. Apartment building. The upstairs neighbor's dog peed on their patio and it dripped down onto me while I was sitting outside reading. I yelled and ran to shower, and when I texted them to ask them to take their dog out to pee in future they said it wasn't their dog and it must have blown over from somewhere else. What? They were crackheads. They had 2 kids, were physically and verbally abusive to each other and were hoarders on top of it. Tried calling Child Protective Services and the police over and over and was never taken seriously. They ended up burning down their apartment and caused thousands of dollars in damage to the rest of the apartment building because they were cooking meth. We had to move out, as did many others. The silver lining is that they finally got their kids taken away after that. Had one that would basically steal our mail and other stuff from our porch and yard. Caught her once to confront her and she started yelling at me to stop attacking her and tried to say I was stealing her stuff. Ended up with the police getting called and us filing a restraining order against her. Just straight up rednecks who wanted the full neighbor experience without putting in any effort themselves. It was like they'd moved from some hillbilly commune where you could just demand things of your neighbors. Every day when I got home from school, the 3 youngest kids would bang on our door until we gave them snacks. One of them, when denied snacks, came back and broke our glass door with a hammer. They turned the shared side yard, legally ours but shared because we weren't necessarily using it, into a lumberyard/playground where they dug a massive pit for mud wrestling. No bullshit there, mud wrestling. The second oldest kid, 6 in total, had an old AC air handling unit in the backyard that he was allowed to hit with a sledgehammer when he got angry. He got angry often and at some pretty irregular hours. I ran into him at a bowling alley years after they moved away/got kicked out/went bankrupt. He had a tattoo across his chest that said Immortal Death in a black radiant. He also had giant scars all over his back, chest and arms. He said he woke up in the middle of the highway on Halloween night, all cut up. Who knows if that's true, but if it could happen to anyone, he was the guy. A few more redneck activities because this comment is getting some attention. Lighting bottle rockets out of the tailpipe on their dad's truck. The youngest kid got stuck in the mud pit up to his head and they couldn't get him out for hours. On rainy nights they used to put these rusty cots in the front yard and sleep in the rain. That one didn't even register as redneck, felt more like an Addams Family thing to do. They somehow got their hands on what looked like municipal park playground equipment, one of which was a steel slide about 2 stories tall. One of the younger kids took a bike up to the top of it and tried to ride down, but fell over backwards and smacked his head on the metal steps a few times. The mom watched him do it and I specifically remember her saying he's gotta learn somehow after he fell. I lived in an apartment with slot of rotating tenants. An elderly lady moved in across the hall from me, promptly started hoarding. I started to figure it out when her deck/porch started to fill up with odds and ends furniture including but not limited to a roll-top desk. She also yelled at me once for taking her key out of the front door and putting it in the mail slot. Anyway, after a couple of weeks I started to realize I hadn't seen her in a while and started to smell something real weird. Turns out she had died and no one knew about it for a week, hence the smell. Her family came and cleared out all her stuff about a week after that. This is Wisconsin in the winter and I had my good Doc Marten work boots outside my door because they were wet. They used one of my boots to prop open their door while they moved out and then stole them when they were done. A bunch of things with my ding-dong neighbor. She had a large dog that hated my older, smaller dog. One day her dog ran into my yard and bit my dog. She did apologize for this one. Did not happen again. Neighbor dumped her lawn clippings into my backyard. Had to ask her to stop and clean up her mess. She decided to build a fence. No survey. So I paid for a survey of my property. She started building her fence 3 feet over on my property. I had her stop and remove the fence. She was angry and never rebuilt it. I painted my house. She painted her house, same color. I bought a new car. She bought a new car, same color, same configuration. There's other minor stuff, but that's enough. Odd person. Very odd. My neighbor once shot both my dogs and his goat and made me bury both. One dog survived thankfully. He then tried to make us pay for a new goat, claiming that our dogs attacked it. The goat had bullet wounds and no bite marks. My mom has a neighbor who literally looks through her window to try to see into the house. She's had to call the cops on her multiple times. We rented a house that had another apartment in the basement. The lady who lived below us kept to herself for the most part, so we didn't see her much. Part of our rental was a detached garage and she asked if she could put small deep freezer in our garage. We were using it for storage, so we were fine with it. After a couple weeks of having her freezer in there, it somehow got unplugged and she came unglued on us and wanted us to pay to replace everything. I understood her frustration, but we hardly ever went into the garage since it was only for storage. In other words, we definitely didn't unplug it and our landlord agreed. But she was pissed. She had a son in college who came home for the summer. During that summer he found a cat and brought it home. His mom said no cats inside, so he would feed the kitten outside. She was pretty wild. He left for school again in the fall and we noticed that the cat was getting very thin. We started feeding her outside in her usual spot. Around Christmas we bought a bag of cat food and I made a plate of cookies and left them both at our neighbor's front door. The next day they were both back on our porch. Rude. Whatever, we continued to feed the cat because she obviously wasn't feeding her. A few weeks later the cat came to our door crying. She was trying to come inside. Super weird considering she was pretty wild and we had never let her inside before. I let her in and noticed she was pregnant and for sure about to have babies. I made her a little corner and she had babies the next day. We let her stay in the house with us but we knew we couldn't keep her. I went downstairs to talk to our neighbor. She said that her son's cat was a boy, so the cat we had obviously wasn't his. I posted on Facebook to see if anyone was interested in fostering a cat and her kittens because we couldn't keep her. Her son saw my post on Facebook and got super mad at his mom. She then called the cops and said that I stole her cat and lied to her when she confronted me about having the cat in my possession. It was the stupidest, most frustrating thing that had ever happened to me as far as neighbors go. Lived in a small apartment and my neighbors always cranked up their music to 11. Like loud. And until something like 7 a.m., maybe later, but that's when I would leave for work. It was so loud that I couldn't hear my own TV over it. My neighbors and I would bang on the door but they would never open the door. It was like trying to sleep at a festival. Then at some point I found out they often left for a bar across the street but would just leave the music on, so I would pull the breaker for their apartment. But they would just come back at 5 a.m. and turn it back on. It was reported by heaps of people, but nothing was ever done, so at some point I would jam their lock when they went out so their keys wouldn't work anymore and they had to get the property manager in while the music was blasting inside. After a couple of times of that happening they were evicted. Maybe I'm the bad neighbor in this story. The block of flats I used to live in was being converted into Airbnb rooms by the landlord. Me and my wife, were the last residential tenants renting there out of the 14 flats. It was unstaffed, so 99% of the time the rooms were booked by in-call escorts, prostitutes and drug dealers. For a solid week we had dealers in and out the door, up and down the adjoining stairwell every 30 minutes. One night we saw a black SUV pull up near the front of the property and try to bundle one of the women who was staying in the dealer room opposite ours. She managed to get away. We called the police as we were scared for her safety. They ended up getting a warrant as we told them of our suspicions, and when tallied up with the attempted bundling, the duty sergeant was happy to bust their door in, searched the lot of them and made arrests. The other adjoining room/flat had a couple staying in it. Got a bit drunk as you do, and we heard them arguing and it getting heated, and at one point some sort of physical violence occurred. Police came again, told the guy to leave and not to return. But he did come back, shouted at her threatening to stab her. A short while later we heard the most terrifying blood-curdling scream and called police again. He went round the back of the property, got in a car and sped off moments before the police turned up. The final tale was literally on my day off, hearing a knock at the flat's bottom door either every half hour or hourly. Saw Johns with their cash waiting to come up and get their end away with a prostitute who stayed for a few nights in the adjoining flat, the drug raid one. John would then leave. Not even 5 minutes later she was on to the next one, and I heard everything. Walls were horrifically thin. I hated that place, but it was that or homelessness. We've now lived in our forever home, a nice bungalow in the countryside, for the last year, and the leave and quiet has been a godsend. I have a schizophrenic neighbor that has believed for years that I am hacking his electronic devices, scanning his phone, harassing/terrorizing him, etc. Over the years he has claimed I've held an old man hostage in my condo, allowed blood to drip from my patio to his, and that I'm a terrible racist. He leaves notes on the inside of his car accusing me of these things. Dude pretended to be a reverend but was actually just a filthy f-king hoarder. He insisted on wearing sandals all of the time, and whenever he left his flat, the entire stairwell would stink of century-old unwashed feet. Eventually, the beetles that had infested his flat crawled up and into our kitchen and then everywhere. Took months to get him evicted. Fuck that guy.